hoping to take everyone through the story of how honey is profoundly part of our development as human beings, and to then contemplate the shame of what it has become, which is essentially a cheap race to the bottom supermarket product. And in that is lost the stories of the honey, the terroir of the honey, and people's abilities to make livings, which is just terrifying. So I think we'll look at all of those things. We'll look at them through also the 4 honeys that I've chosen from the Ark of Taste, which I'm pretty familiar with them, and they're ones that I know producers of and stuff. So they're quite close to my heart. So I hope I'm going to take people back to the idea that there's a real joy to be found in exploring the world of honey and being adventurous with it. First of all, I'm going to take everybody back way, way further, though, to the primeval slime. So honeybees have been on Earth for 88 million years, is pretty much the usual reckoning. So Homo erectus, 1.8 million years. We are really Johnny come lately in the story of honey. So the bees just got on, they evolved alongside the flowering plants, and they quietly made honey and enjoyed their life. So when we crawled out of the slime, we couldn't even be dignified as hunter-gatherers. We were scavengers. We were scavenging bits of meat, of birds' eggs, of starchy tubers and grasses. And the one thing that we didn't have in that diet was sweetness. Sweetness came from honey. Sweetness was an absolute revelation to our ancestors. It was the most extraordinary sensation. And when we put honey in our mouths today, we're really connecting with our ancestors, because that sweetness that they found in that very early stage of human development actually led to the formation of neural pathways which respond to sweetness, and it was honey that set those up. Those neural pathways are very, very similar to how we respond to drugs. So in other words, we are absolutely addicted to, and we are hardwired to seek the sweetness. And that goes back to our profoundly ancestral relationship with honey. So you may say, ha ha ha, but what about the tubers and the fruits? Well, the answer is that they weren't sweet then. They were not sweet. We bred them sweet. We bred our carrots to be those sugary, orange, pappy things. We bred those tiny little bitter crab apples to be those puffy, white, sweet, sweet, sweet things. We have a primeval drive for sugars, and it's a major factor in the success of junk food in the modern world, because it's so easy for food scientists to direct our desires with sugar. So thinking about that, let's just go back. Let's go back to how we have this profoundly ancient connection, which started from survival and then elevated into the sacred. So what honey represented to our ancestors as food was that it was a very high energy, very portable, very storable food that gave them the most fantastic energy kick. It also was probably the very first form of alcohol, because it has a natural tendency to ferment. So you can look at honey as being also mankind's first experience with being off their head with alcohol, which is probably quite exciting at the time. So long before recorded history, you'll see people were hunting for wild bees. Later they would adopt the hive sites, and then they became beekeepers. So that transition, bees and honey have actually allowed us to part of our transition from hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. Also, though they didn't realize this, and it wasn't really understood until as late as the 1700s, about the bees' pollination services. They knew that the bees had a connection with plants. They didn't really know what that was, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Also, really fascinatingly, right from very earliest records, there are references to honey and milk, the land of milk and honey. It comes up time and time again in any nation or any culture that was beekeeping and had dairy animals. Milk and honey have been incredibly closely allied. And in some modern research, they found out that actually human beings with a little bit of vitamin C could live for extended periods just on milk and honey, which is so our ancestors were not wrong there. So another really potent use of honey was as medicine. used internally and externally. Now, it's only recently we've actually made this very strong distinction between food and medicine. You go to the chemist for medicine, you go to the market for food. Essentially, you know, up until the time of our grandparents, these two were really closely allied. But as an actual medicine, a curative, potent substance, honey's pretty much a staple right throughout. It enabled primitive people to actually do a fantastic amount. And you will find that there's a Sumerian clay tablet from 2000 BC from the Mesopotamians, which is a really detailed and sophisticated medical treatise. And more than 30% of the prescriptions in those tablets involve honey in some way or another, mostly for skin and often for eye conditions, which we'll come back to as well. So its wound healing qualities were really, really clearly understood by people, the Romans, the Greeks. People would take it onto the battlefields. The Egyptians would understood it. Alexander the Great was preserved in honey and taken home. His body was taken home. So part of honey's potency is in being a supersaturative sugar. So because it is so full of sugars, nothing can grow in it. So you can't have viruses, you can't have yeasts, you can't have bacteria flourishing in something which is just basically going to suck them dry. So pretty much any raw honey, we will establish that the parameters of raw in a minute, is going to be antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and probably quite a lot of other things too. These will be in varying degrees, but the point is that it's a pretty universal set of properties that belong to honey. And really well documented are the specifics. So you would choose a particular honey for a particular condition. So right up into the current day, for instance, buckwheat honey is really closely associated with the management of hypertension and diabetes. Manuka has hijacked the headlines. We would be led to believe there was no other medical honey on earth. That's marketing. It's a dead good honey. If you had a very deep wound or you had a burn, Manuka would be your go-to. Taken internally, it has no greater or lesser powers than many other fantastic world honeys. So we have things like Sidr, S-I-D-R, which is the great medical honey of the Middle East. We have honeydew, we have chestnut, we have Chilean ulmo. All over the world, there are honeys which actually are being investigated and tend, not always, but tend to live up to their folk uses. Also, of course, medicinal use extended into cosmetics. So, you know, primitive people are allowed to look nice too. You could use honey to beautify your skin and your hair. You had people bathing in ass's milk and honey, back to that milk and honey connection. And this is largely to do with the humectant, the sugars, again, that keep moisture locked in. But it also crosses into honey's curative powers for skin infections and imperfections. And my mum used to make me put honey on my teenage acne. I think it worked. We'll see. But so each of those honeys that we're going to be looking at today, it is implicit in them that they have a medical use for the community from which they come. And also medically, it's not just about honey. There's another substance that the bees make called propolis, which is a resin that they bring into the hive. That's the bees' own medicine, but it also has some really interesting properties. And one of our apprentice beekeepers, who was a medical student, was studying the effect of propolis on cancer cells some years ago, and it was looking really interesting. So the bees continue to keep up with our drive to find new stuff. It is not just embedded in history. This is current stuff as well. So given that you've got that food value and the excitement that it generated in our early brains, and the nourishment that it offered to us, given that it had importance as food, as medicine, and as cosmetics, it is not surprising that it became a very important trade good. People who had honey, or later beeswax as well, had a really valuable product. So they could barter that for other life-sustaining essentials, which supported their cultural development, whether that be necessities or luxuries. It would enable people to actually progress, to have other goods which they couldn't make themselves, but would actually enhance their lives. So it was regularly traded between different cultures in the ancient world, both settled and nomadic people. It was one of the key commodities that went back and forth on the Silk Route. People also, as we were saying, sought out particular honeys for specific things. And bizarrely, a lot of honey went into China Now a lot of honey comes out of China, but China was one of the biggest purchasers of honey on the Silk Route. So it was used as money. It was paid, tithes and taxes were paid in honey, and it was given as gifts to kings and princes. It was really valuable. Honey has been big money forever, forever. And this is it's another factor in why we end up where we are with its utter degradation. So again, all of these things mount up. You have this thing which is fantastically useful as a food and a medicine. It's a trade good. Where does it come from? So for a very, very, very long time, the ancients believed it came from the heavens, from the gods. This was such an extraordinary substance. There was nothing like it. The only way you could possibly wrap your head around it was to say, this has been given as a bounty to human beings from the gods. So as time went on, it has developed a central role in mythology, in magic, in religion, and in ceremonial tradition. And because it's nourishing, it's healing, it's enriching, you can see that it would look as if the gods had done this very, very kind thing for humans. The ancients and the Greeks legends are entirely full of stories about honey. Zeus was nourished on honey as a baby in a cave. It's been almost universally used in consecratory rites since, you know, before written records. The Mithraeans, the Mayans, countless other cultures. And, oh my goodness, if you start going into the sacred books, so the Talmud, the Quran, the Rig Veda, the Hindus' Rig Veda, the Bible, full of references to bees and honey. The manna that the Israelites gathered in the desert as they were leaving Egypt is very likely crystallized honeydew. The Oracle at Delphi was a bee cult. The Vestal Virgins were a bee cult. Every time that the gods had a hand in our fate, we would appeal to them, we would make offerings to them and say, make it go our way. So all those milestones like harvest times, birth, marriage and death, all marked by honey and often by enormous respect for the bees. Rather strangely, there's records about Ramesses III of Egypt tipping 15 tons of honey as a sacrifice into the Nile gods, into the Nile, to ask the Nile gods to guard his kingdom. That I don't know much more about this, a hard story to track down, but what it does tell us is the fantastic quantities of honey that Egypt was producing. It was one of the first cultures to actually keep bees as not just as incidentals that you would go hunting for, but actually in clay pots, in the very earliest form of beehives. The other thing that they did, which was again has become something that is routine now, but was new then, was that they practiced migratory beekeeping. They would have the hives on barges that were towed up the Nile to follow the cessational flowerings of the crops. They understood the relationship between the bees and the crops, but they didn't understand exactly what it was about. Also, very not so true today, the court officials who looked after the bees for the pharaohs were amongst the highest status and most highly paid officials in the whole court. I think a lot of beekeepers would quite like that to be the case again. So honey is embedded in human consciousness and in our evolution. So we revere it, we seek its powers. It has multiple points of cultural meaning. Whatever religion we come from, it's there as a sort of standard thing coming up. We honor the bees, and in theory, we honor the beekeepers who tend them. So how have we come to this modern state of affairs where honey is globalized, blended, aggressively processed and commoditized to sell at the lowest possible price? I mean, it's just a startling fall from grace for a substance that has sustained humankind. So I often say, essentially nowadays, the majority of honey that's sold in the world isn't made in hives by bees. It's made in factories by food scientists, and that's a very terrible thing. And we now have a state of affairs where honey is pretty nearly globally acknowledged as one of the most adulterated foodstuffs on earth, after wine and olive oil, which are interesting, the closest two equivalences in a way to understanding the truth behind honey. So my husband came up with something the other day. He said in a sort of amusing way, he said, how did honey become an ingredient in honey? I mean, that's a vile question, isn't it? But it's true. So it started with the Second World War, really. You can trace it maybe back to the First World War, but in the Second World War, humankind became very adept at convenience foods, at feeding people nationally and internationally, preserving stuff, shipping things around in volume, and also learning how to process them to make them easier to do that with. Also, when people came back from the Second World War, there was a huge reluctance to go back to the land. People really didn't want to return to jobs as agricultural workers if they didn't have to. So you have a massive urbanization, you have a huge opening up of the countryside and the beginning of monocropping, and the focus was taken off artisanal local production. And honey did very much suffer through that. So starting in the 1940s in North America, you have big monoculture, you would have masses and masses of really quite bleh honey. A lot of it was clover. I grew up with this foul Canadian clover honey. I remember it really distinctly. But so in the 40s, they started experimenting with processing it and blending it to soften it, to make it more acceptable to the consumer in various ways. And this is accelerated right up into the present day. So the big global producers have continued to develop ways to standardize honey. So there's a standardized viscosity, there's a standardized color, and there are processes to slow the natural crystallization of honey down to give it a shelf life. But above all, what they're at is driving down the price. I just want to just show you, this is the categorization of colors of honey. This is the international categorization. It's a very blunt instrument, but it's worth looking at. So look at this dark honey here, the light honey there. Isn't it funny that everything that you buy on a supermarket shelf is there? Isn't that an amazing coincidence? Not because it's blended. It's blended to that color because we think that's honey color. That is the color that we have been completely brainwashed to look for. So, you know, whether those prices, that product, they are achieved by adulteration with cheaper sugar syrups, and they're also achieved in a horrible way by making slaves of both the bees and the beekeepers in terms of the volumes of production and the way that people are forced to keep bees in order to make any sort of living at all. So we've taken honey in all its wonderful, funky, natural variety. A lot of honeys aren't even naturally sweet. And we've standardized it and rendered it, instead of it being a culturally meaningful, seasonal, regional speciality, it's just become an always the same, off the shelf sweetener. So it's the same, you know, always the same. I feel that this sort of product is a ghost. It is only very tenuously related to the real thing. And I think that consumers should be allowed to understand that, and it should be called honey flavored syrup, or what has happened to it should be declared on the labeling in order to let small people actually sell their products, their unprocessed products, at premium prices, because the loss of flavor, the loss of authenticity, the loss of locality is also the loss of beekeepers' livelihoods. And set against the background of the rise of the global brands and supermarkets and convenience foods, no one's really noticed honey's decline until it's almost too late. So the cheap processed transshipped honeys really dominate world markets now. In the UK, only 14% of the honey that we consume is actually made in this country, made in the UK. Nowadays, the rest of it is all is transshipped. This is happening right across Europe, and there's some very important research was done by several farmers' unions, a group called Copa Coqueba, and they have flagged up to the EU the risk of Europe losing some 10 million hives over the next few years. Now, this is critical. This is not about honey production. This is about the pollination services that those bees offer and our ability to actually produce food domestically, rather than, again, having to ship things all around the world. So these blended commodity imports are selling for as little as €1.30 a kilo, selling at €1.30. Actual average cost of production across European beekeepers is €3.90 a kilogram. So it's almost impossible for people to compete, let alone we then look at other people all over the world with you know, sort of small producers in Africa or India or wherever, developing countries. It's really hard for them to actually get a foothold into this market unless they're going to sell to the big honey packers and have their product blended. There is a jar of honey in Aldi for sale now at 85 pence, which is just, you know, you just have to say how can this be? How can this happen? So this for me is why the work of the slow food movement and the Ark of Taste is so valuable, to preserve and encourage producers of small, local, single source honeys. As far as I know, it is literally the only campaigning body anywhere in the world at any level taking any notice at all of the plight of honey and honey producers. I honestly cannot think of anybody else who's doing that. So this makes it just so important that we can view stuff through the prism of the work that goes into it. So I find, I mean, I have several Instagram accounts, but my Honey Sommelier London account, I post things about honey the whole time, and they, you know, they get a reasonable sort of, you know, click through. On my actual personal account, I sometimes post those things too, and I get a sort of back. If I put a picture of the dog doing something funny, you know, I'll get tons. People just somehow don't want to interact with this honey, and that includes a lot of really important, influential chefs who really have the ability to influence people and change people's buying habits, and they are routinely buying and using squeezy processed honey. It's become a don't even think about it type of commodity, which I find really sad. So because I've got all of you as my captive audience, I'm going to try and really engage you in the world of raw honey, in a way that is super important. Now, the word raw I'm using to designate honey that has never been heated above hive temperature, i.e. it hasn't been cooked. Commercial honeys are routinely heated way above hive temperature, with disastrous consequences for the honey itself. But it makes it easier for them to blend it and do all sorts of other processes. So raw honey, straight from the hive, minimally processed, spun out, crushed out, whatever it may be, put through very coarse filters just to basically take bits of dead bee and wax, excess wax out of it. That is the sort of honeys that we're talking about. Before we go look at these honeys though closely, I just want you to try and put your brains into understanding honey through the same prism that we absolutely know we understand wine and olive oil through. So I want you to understand the incredible hard work, the hard physical work that goes into making honey, and the incredible specialist knowledge of the producers. They are people, they're heroes. They work so hard, and they are scientists and craftspeople all rolled into one. It's a hard life. Also, the cultural authenticity of their beekeeping practices and product are really important. They're not the same globally. People have completely different ways of keeping bees, different bees, as we'll see as well. And the sheer individuality and the natural variation of their product. We know this about wine. We know this about olive oil and chocolate and coffee. Why do we not know it about honey? Why are we not seeking that from honey? And the very central role that terroir plays when you create a product from the soil. The bees are feeding on plants that are drawing from the soil health and the composition and the climate impact very profoundly on honey and are part of the joy. And that comes to, as we were saying, it being a postcard of the place that it is. So my apologies in advance to the 4 producers who I'm going to showcase. Any one of them I could talk about for an hour, but we're going to have to just literally whiz through their stories, and just you know, we'll come back to them maybe another time. So my first one is arbutus, the wild strawberry tree. Wonderful. Look at the colour of that honey. A little bit of lovely beeswax there, which is just going to give you a fantastic mouthfeel. I am cheating a bit because this arbutus is listed in the Ark of Taste through an Albanian producer. It's a very widespread tree though. So I feel justified in talking to you about a man called Alexandros Kozarius, who produced this honey. He was the star of a film which was also is being shown in the Fringe, called When Tomatoes Met Wagner. And if you haven't seen that film, I absolutely urge you to make it. So he's working as a beekeeper and a tomato producer in a very remote and depopulated area. His village is entirely full of old people now. Everybody who's young has gone off to seek work elsewhere. I think there's 36 people in the village now who he employs, and that's virtually the whole village. So Greece has, in Europe, Greece has the most varied flora possible. They make the most wonderful honeys, and he follows the traditional migratory practice of moving its hives to get seasonal flowerings, and he produces a whole range of honeys, and you can find them here in the UK under the Odysseus label, and I commend them because they are wonderful, wonderful honeys. His commitment is just extraordinary to what he's doing, and I've just heard actually today that his tomato crop failed this year due to flood and storms. I mean, that's a disaster. It really is, because there's nowhere to go when you're living actually on the edge, as he is, and what he's trying to do. You won't find this varietal though. This is a secret jar that he gave me last year, and I've been just eating little bits of it every now and then. The wild strawberry tree is one of the most ancient honeys on record, and it connects us just directly with the classical world. It was written about by both Pliny and Ovid. Now, I find this so compelling, the idea that we're putting into our mouths this substance that connects us straight to our ancestors. Nothing is going to be different about this honey as to compared to what they had. So it's called, I have to say that both Pliny and Ovid did comment on it both favorably and unfavorably, because it's called the bitter honey, miele amaro, and it's quite an acquired taste. It's very high in antioxidants. It's an autumn harvest, so it's the honey that's going to support your health through the winter, and it's going to support your immune system and treat your seasonal coughs and colds. You could also use it in the kitchen. It's really delicious honey in the kitchen. It's traditionally paired with cheeses such as young pecorino, and it has a flavour which is really, really addictive. And this honey couldn't be more different from the standardized view of honey that's constructed for us by the honey packers. This is really, really something funky. So I'm not sure that we're going to have time to do a proper tasting on each of these honeys, but I'm just going to show you a technique that will enable you to, sorry, a little bit of a drink here. Enable you to cross taste honeys in a very interesting way, because it turns off your brain's desire to tell you how sweet the honey is. With that, that pathway I was talking about, it tends to hijack because we have that big area on our tongue that just says, oh, it's sweet, and our brain is content with that, and it won't explore the rest of it given half a chance. So what we're going to do when we're tasting is you're going to take a big, delicious, generous spoonful of honey. You can't taste just a blob, and you're going to put it into your mouth with your nose held, and you're going to count to 5. So which takes the honey onto your palate. The majority of what we taste is on our palate. We've bypassed the brain and it's seeking the sweetness. So very bitter on first approach, bitter, and then suddenly this really swift transition into berry fruits, a little bit of vinegar, and then into coffee and spice. If you leave it in your mouth, the evolution of a good honey is super important, and it's how you understand what you might pair it with is on that evolution. It actually evolves into sort of a jelly baby candy, which is really fantastic, but I actually guarantee you'll be diving back into it before then to taste those bitter notes and to find a way through back into that bitterness, which is just wonderful. So deservedly known as the bitter honey, but actually something that we can use both for health and in our kitchens and enjoy. So we're going to go from this ancient honey with its really profound connection to the classical world into a really intriguingly contemporary one. So here we have Tasmanian leatherwood honey. entered into the Ark of Taste at number 7. It's like top of the pops. It only exists because Tasmania was settled as a British penal colony from the early 1800s. It wouldn't exist otherwise. And just as in North America, where the settlers went, so did their hives. So they transported them on the penal ships. The first few waves of honeybees that they took over were British strains, traditional British strains, but they didn't thrive at all. And later on, they found that Italian bees were really up to the climate and they could take full advantage of these leatherwood trees, which are an extraordinary, wonderful, ancient tree that forms the understory of Tasmania's ancient temperate forests, the eucalyptus being the top story of them. So from January to March, the leatherwoods flower, and apparently the smell is just absolutely overwhelming. I would really love to go and experience this. They produce these incredible waxy white blooms, and the honeybees are taken into the forest specifically for that feast, and they produce a honey that is absolutely something that you would never forget it. If you've ever tasted it, you will never forget it. And it's been 70% of Tasmania's overall honey production. They've depended on it for a very long time. But with climate change and with modern economies and all sorts of things driving this, they have a real problem in continuing production because the logging, the forest fires, and also drought have depleted the seasonal sites where they take the bees to make leatherwood. So these sites will take over 100 years to recover. The leatherwood tree doesn't even begin to flower until it's 70 years old. So it's not something you can really cash crop very easily. The beekeepers are now seeking help from the government to be allowed to take their bees deeper into the forest, into the wilderness, to access ever more remote places of these World Heritage sites. It's tricky environmentally for everybody, the whole question. So in the meantime, it remains very precarious, the production of leatherwood. It's rarer and more sought after, and it may be that before long it'll cease to be available anywhere but Tasmania. But do try it. If you have a chance to try it, it is a really phenomenal honey. So I'll read you my 4 top things I would always say about leatherwood. So they're big, waxy florals. They start on the nose. The moment you take the lid off that, you can smell it on the other side of the room. They're very exotic florals, but they have this intriguing camphorous thing going on behind it. So if any of you had old aunts who smelt of mothballs, as I did, there's just something in leatherwood that just has a little bit of that mothball, slightly beery, and then you've got vanilla and spice. It's an absolutely fantastic honey. It doesn't have any huge medicinal qualities, I think largely because it's not been investigated much. But it's traditionally used for all the same things you'll find across the world, coughs and colds. It's a local remedy for that. So following on from this environmentally sensitive area of the Tasmanian forests, we're going to go and look at this honey, which comes from a very, possibly even more sensitive area, which is Madagascar. So this is from the mokarana tree. And it's again a very characterful honey. Madagascar has, as we all know, has a unique flora and fauna. Approximately 90% of the species are endemic to the island, but its millions and millions of acres of forests have been compromised by logging, slash and burn agriculture, and probably most importantly, still into the current day, the production of charcoal, because a very, very low percent of Malagasy homes actually have electricity. So charcoal remains a primary energy resource. So Madagascar has now lost more than 90% of its original forest, and 44% of that is since the 1950s. And the mokarana tree, which is in those forests, is also threatened by the fact that where people are replanting, they're tending to replant cash cropping trees that will give them essential oils, because that's a very big market for them to sell internationally. This is not a tree that's going to produce essential oils. So it's not one that, again, we might see continuously being sidelined and not being available. Because of the deforestation, beekeepers have really had a very, very tough time. It's only in the last couple of decades that they really started to understand the connection between the forests and their bees, the fact that bees need trees. Honeybees forget about wildflower meadows. If anyone gives you a packet of wildflower seeds and says, you know, grow this for the bees, please put it in the bin and get real. Let's plant real things that properly sustain pollinators. And in beekeepers, you know, all beekeepers know that what their bees principally feed on, their honeybees, is trees, and small trees, which are called bushes, and very, very small trees, which are called herbaceous perennials. So those are the three top things to plant for honeybees. So the honey yields were dropping and dropping as the forest was eroded. Beekeepers were being pushed into traveling further and further, carrying the hives on their heads, which was just incredibly time consuming and backbreaking. And they were not being adequately rewarded because the prices for their honey were not high enough. So there's been a lot of charities and a lot of NGOs involved in trying to break this cycle and trying to make beekeeping a viable economy for them. This jar is from a company called Ilanga Nature. They're a commercial entity, but they are involved in planting 1 million trees in Madagascar for bees. So pollinator friendly trees. And they're also supporting beekeepers by allowing them to process their honey on the spot with mobile extraction trucks. And there's very few roads in Madagascar, so these are really like, whoo, go anywhere sort of trucks. But they're addressing also an ongoing problem of honey not being extracted hygienically and questions of possible adulteration. So if it's actually extracted where the hives are, under supervision and certified there, it becomes something that stands a chance of being able to be sold into international markets, which gives them a much higher income for their honey and starts to put money back into an economy. If beekeepers are paid fair amounts for their honey, they can become a really powerful force for good in their communities, and empowering beekeepers to become the natural guardians of the forest. It's only a tiny, tiny tile in the huge complex mosaic of guarding Madagascar's biodiversity, but it makes this honey really precious. And it's not just because it's an extraordinary product from an extraordinary tree. It's the hope of renewal, which it actually has in this jar, which I find really exciting. And it occupies a very rightful place in the Ark of Taste. Lastly, I'm just checking the time here. I'm going to crack on through here. This is a Cuban wildflower honey, and it is not made by honeybees. It's made by an entirely different species of bee, the Melipone. They are stingless bees. There are masses more types of stingless bee in the world than there are of honeybees. There's only seven species of honeybee in the world. There are hundreds of species of these stingless bees, but they have a different life cycle. They don't produce very much honey. They've been domesticated for just as long as the honeybee has by mankind, but not to the same effect. You can't have a really big commercial organization built around this sort of honey. This particular one comes from a man who I've become friends with on Instagram, and we talk, and it's his story is fascinating. He's called Aniel Frank. His company is called Mieles Don Ferro, and he was an electrical engineer who grew up in Cuba, surrounded by the Melipona beechii, which is the unique species that you've got there. And he built his first hive in 2000 to house a wild colony. He's been growing his stocks very slowly, very carefully by dividing the nests. And it wasn't until 2006 that he was actually making enough honey to begin selling a tiny amount every year. And he's building a sustainable business to honor both the bees and the environment they live in, because they are unique pollinators of the place where they live. Honeybees aren't doing that job in that place, and it's a very important place in an ecological reserve in Cuba. So the Meliponini or the beechii are known in Cuba as the earth bee, and the Mayans held them to be sacred. They build really long-lived social colonies, and very small amounts of honey have to be extracted by hand with disposable syringes. So this is not something which can stand up against the weight of normal honeybees and their extraordinary talent for stripping an environment given half a chance. So this is a very, very delicate balance that is being maintained by keeping these bees. And the place where this comes from is Sancti Spiritus, which is one of the 3 areas that is listed in the Ark of Taste for producing this honey. It is an insanely different taste, a completely and utterly different taste from anything that you've ever tasted honey-wise before. I've just taken the top of it, and the smell is absolutely wonderful. It's really tart, it's much more acidic, far higher protein components. There's a lot more pollen in it than in normal apis bees honey. It's tart and fruity. It's like a tropical fruit salad. If you ever have a chance to taste a stingless bee honey, it really is something that will amaze you, really amaze you. I just want to just very quickly go back to talking about honeybees, because I was distinguishing them from these bees. Please let nobody ever tell you that honeybees are going extinct. They are not. They are a kept species. The numbers of honeybees is entirely due to mankind. So, you know, people do terrible things and they do suffer horribly in some areas, particularly in the US, where they're trucked across the country. But in the UN's own figures, there are currently 93 million hives worldwide, up from 66 million in 1994. These are not the bees we have to worry about. The bees who produce this and the many, many other species of bee who live on Earth and the wild pollinators, they're the ones who we should be investing our time and energy in really looking after in their natural habitats and preserving them. Just to quickly just backtrack on this. This too is another honey, rather like cedar honey and various others, which is very, very famed for its effect on eyes. So it's used as a specific for sore eyes and even cataracts and things, as well as for flu and for coughs and for colds. I'm just wondering if I've got time. Have I got time to tell you a 5-minute story?
Yeah, if you do a 5-minute story, can I just do, we've had a few comments, just basically how illuminating, passionate, your knowledge, how inspiring. Honestly, it's been absolutely amazing. One quick one from Sarah Saunders. Just where can, I think what Sarah wants to know is where she can get in touch with the Cuban honey makers, or is there any way?
Yeah, he's actually, I think he's with us tonight. Yes, it's called Mieles Don Ferro, and it's online. Right. You'll find it online. If you search, you'll find his site there, or come to me if it doesn't. I can connect you.
Right. Okay, we've definitely got time. We've just got time. I'll tell you a
very embarrassing story. I got very drunk one night, and I woke up at 3 in the morning, and I looked at my eyebrows, and I thought it's definitely time that I plucked my eyebrows. So at 3 in the morning, with a very sharp pair of tweezers, I managed to actually scratch my eyeballs so deeply that the pain was excruciating. I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was Good Friday. And I thought, well, I'm not going to, you know, I can't go to hospital because I can't even get in the car. And what the hell, you know, it's Easter weekend. So I treated it with honey. I had a neighbour's honey we were up in Suffolk, and he produces a fairly average rape canola honey, nothing to write home about, but raw, proper honey. And I diluted it and I washed my eye with it about 5 times a day. And then I went to see my ophthalmologist on the Tuesday after Easter to confess what I'd done and to get him to have a look at this scratch. And he said, well, A, the scratch is healed, and B, you did exactly the right thing, which was to treat it with honey. So there we are, a really, you know, an embarrassing little story, but one which actually proves. So I just I'm going to wind up by just saying these 4 honeys, they all cast light on the unique nature of the honey, where they come from, their connection with the environment. Small producers can only live if they are intimately connected with their environment, and their ability to keep their bees healthy depends on them being able to sell their special honeys at fair prices to people who really recognize the difference between that and a supermarket honey. So the more that we seek out and demand raw single source honeys, and they need to come either from the primary producer or from a trusted intermediary. I think that's really the only way. The better that we can celebrate and preserve not just the 111 honeys that are listed in the Ark of Taste, but the really hundreds of thousands of artisan honeys worldwide. So I'm going to leave you now with a quote from Mary Quick, the cheesemaker, who I love this her urging us for conscious shopping. And she says, be inspired by your connection to food and farming, the power you have and the difference you make in the world. Thank you.
Sarah, I don't know what to say. That's been probably the best 45 minutes I've had in years. Honestly, it's been so inspiring. I love honey. I loved honey 45 minutes ago, and now it's just I've been writing down. Everybody's been clicking in with websites where we can source the honey, especially the Cuban honey. There's Hermione Winters from Slow Food Ireland said I could listen to her all night. I think we all. The 45 minutes was definitely not long enough, Sarah. But Shane also put something up there, and I think hopefully the discussion or the information will continue through slowfood.com.
Fantastic.
So, but I think the thing is that we all do buy raw honey. I think it's about educating, isn't it? It's about educating everybody and taking this on to really encourage people to buy raw honey and
just understanding the difference. You know, you may not always want an incredibly dark bitter honey, but I mean, my kitchen cupboard has got, that's my downstairs I've got about 300 honeys in my library. My kitchen cupboard's got about 30, and I will say to myself, which honey do I want to make this dressing with? Which honey do I want? You know, honey isn't honey. Honey's just a descriptor of an incredible range of flavors and tastes, and this profound connection to where they come from. That excites me so much. It's like traveling. You know, we can't travel at the moment, but boy, can we travel through honey.
I would love to travel to your honey cupboard now, to be honest with you.
You have a standing invitation to come and play in my honey library.
Sarah, thank you so much on behalf of everybody. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate your time.